9 worshippers shot dead, a few more injured. A few minutes back, no one would have imagined that this innocent-looking teenager would commit such a crime. For the past 1 hour, he had worshipped with them, listened to the sermon, and even began praying before he brought out a handgun and opened fire. The victims were targeted for one reason alone: the color of their skin.
The killer's name was Dylan Roof, a 1-year-old high school dropout from Columbia, South Carolina, who confessed to his crime and gave his reason, stating that he hoped to ignite a race war. What followed his arrest was a chilling journey into the mind of a homegrown terrorist, a trial that captivated the nation, and a death sentence that raised profound questions about radicalization, mental illness, and the nature of evil itself. This is the story of how investigators pieced together the making of a mass murderer, how a community responded with grace that stunned the world, and how the justice system confronted domestic terrorism in its most undeniable form. The massacre began at approximately 9:05 p.m. Eastern Time, which was a long time after Roof entered the church building. Survivors would later testify that Roof fired methodically, reloading his weapon 5 times. He shot some victims multiple times, ensuring they were dead. 3 people survived by playing dead or hiding under tables. One survivor, Polly Shepard, would later recount that Roof told her he was letting her live so she could tell people what happened. "I have to do it," he told her. "You rape our women, and you're taking over our country, and you have to go." Within minutes of the first 911 call, Charleston police flooded the area. The crime scene was devastating. Officers found 9 bodies scattered throughout the fellowship hall. The victims were Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons Sr., Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson, and the church's senior pastor, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who also served as a South Carolina state senator. The victims would later be referred to as the Emmanuel 9. Each had been shot multiple times. The brutality was undeniable, but so was the specificity of the target. This was terrorism, designed to target an entire community, to send a message, to ignite a race war. The investigation moved with remarkable speed. Surveillance footage from the church showed the suspect arriving in a distinctive vehicle, a black Hyundai Elantra with a Confederate flag license plate. Within hours, law enforcement had distributed images of the suspect and his vehicle to agencies across the Southeast. The FBI immediately classified the shooting as a hate crime and potential act of domestic terrorism, bringing federal resources to bear. By dawn, investigators had a name: Dylan Storm Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist. Roof had made no attempt to disguise himself during the massacre. Witnesses provided detailed descriptions, and once investigators had his identity, the pieces began falling into place with alarming clarity. This wasn't someone who had snapped in a moment of rage. This was someone who had planned meticulously, radicalized himself over time, and documented his journey toward violence in ways that would provide investigators with a disturbing roadmap of his descent into extremism. The manhunt ended less than 14 hours after the shooting. On the morning of June 18, 2015, a florist in Shelby, North Carolina, about 250 miles from Charleston, recognized Roof's vehicle from news reports. She called police, and officers quickly located the black Hyundai. When they pulled Roof over, he was alone, driving calmly, as if he were on a routine trip and nothing had happened just the night before. He surrendered without resistance. In the car, officers found the .45 caliber Glock pistol used in the murders, along with magazines and ammunition. Roof waived his Miranda rights and began talking almost immediately. If you're interested in understanding how hate crimes are investigated and prosecuted, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We explore cases that reveal the darkest corners of human nature while examining how the justice system responds. What emerged from Roof's confession and the subsequent investigation was a portrait of radicalization that had been hiding in plain sight. Roof admitted to the killings without hesitation. He told investigators he had chosen the Mother Emanuel AME Church specifically because of its historical significance in the black community and its prominence. He said he had initially considered targeting the College of Charleston, but decided a church would have fewer security measures. He had visited the church earlier in the year to scout the location. Every action had been calculated, every decision made with the explicit intent to kill as many black people as possible. But the question that haunted investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately the nation was, how does a 1-year-old from suburban South Carolina become capable of such calculated, cold-blooded murder? The answer lay in the digital trail Roof had left behind, a trail that revealed the insidious nature of online radicalization. Just hours after Roof's arrest, investigators discovered a website registered under his name, The Last Rhodesian. The site contained a manifesto, a 2,444-word document that laid out Roof's racist ideology in chilling detail. He wrote about being awakened to the truth about race after researching the Trayvon Martin case online. He described falling down a rabbit hole of white supremacist websites, consuming propaganda about black-on-white crime statistics that were either fabricated or wildly distorted. He railed against integration, immigration, and what he perceived as the displacement of white people. And he made his intentions clear. He was acting because, in his view, no one else would. The website also contained dozens of photographs of Roof posing with Confederate flags, white supremacist symbols, and firearms. In some images, he visited historical plantation sites and Confederate landmarks. In others, he pointed guns at the camera or burned American flags. The photos had been taken in the months leading up to the massacre, a visual chronicle of his radicalization. What was particularly disturbing was how ordinary many of the images seemed. Roof at the beach, Roof in a park, a young man living his life while simultaneously preparing for mass murder. Investigators also discovered that Roof had purchased the Glock pistol legally in April 2015, just 2 months before the shooting. He had passed a background check, despite having a prior drug arrest that should have flagged him as prohibited from owning firearms. The FBI later admitted this was a mistake in the background check system, a procedural failure that allowed Roof to arm himself. The gun dealer had followed proper protocols, but a miscommunication between agencies meant that Roof's disqualifying arrest wasn't properly flagged within the mandatory 3-day waiting period. The psychological profile of Dylan Roof became a central focus as the case moved toward trial. Court-appointed experts evaluated him extensively, and what they found was complex and deeply troubling. Roof exhibited signs of social anxiety, depression, and possible autism spectrum disorder. He had dropped out of high school in the 9th grade and had become increasingly isolated. Friends and family members would later describe him as withdrawn, someone who spent most of his time alone, online, consuming extremist content. He had few real-world connections and seemed to live primarily in a digital echo chamber that reinforced and amplified his racist beliefs. But here's where the case raises difficult questions about mental illness and accountability. While Roof showed signs of psychological disturbance, multiple experts concluded that he understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. He knew killing was illegal. He knew it would cause immense suffering. He chose to do it anyway because he believed his racist ideology justified the violence. This is a crucial distinction in criminal law. Having mental health issues is not the same as being legally insane or unable to understand right from wrong. Roof's defense team would argue during the trial that his mental state should be considered as a mitigating factor against the death penalty. They wanted to present evidence of his psychological vulnerabilities, his troubled development, his isolation. But Roof himself rejected this strategy. In a highly unusual move, he fired his defense attorneys during the sentencing phase and represented himself, specifically to prevent them from presenting evidence about his mental health. Why? Because Roof didn't want to be portrayed as mentally ill. He wanted to be seen as a political actor, someone making a rational choice to advance a cause. In his twisted worldview, being labeled mentally ill would delegitimize his actions as the ravings of a madman, rather than the deliberate act of a white supremacist warrior. Drop a comment below about whether you think mental illness should ever be a mitigating factor in hate crime cases, or if ideological motivation negates that consideration. It's one of the most difficult questions in criminal justice. The trial itself was a two-phase process: the guilt phase and the penalty phase. The guilt phase was straightforward. Roof had confessed. There were survivors who witnessed the massacre. The physical evidence was overwhelming. In December 2016, a federal jury took less than 2 hours to convict Dylan Roof on all 33 federal charges, including hate crimes, obstruction of religion, and firearms violations. The speed of the verdict reflected the clarity of the evidence. There was simply no doubt about what Roof had done. The penalty phase, which would determine whether Roof received the death penalty or life in prison, was where the real legal battle occurred. Federal death penalty cases are exceedingly rare. The government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that aggravating factors outweigh any mitigating factors. In Roof's case, the aggravating factors were substantial. The murders were racially motivated. They were intended to intimidate and terrorize a community. They targeted people engaged in religious worship, and they were committed after substantial planning and premeditation. The victims' families testified about the devastating impact of their losses, about futures that would never be realized, about the ripples of trauma that extended through entire communities. The defense, even without Roof's cooperation, tried to present mitigating evidence. They argued that Roof's youth, his isolated upbringing, his exposure to extremist propaganda online, and his psychological vulnerabilities should weigh against a death sentence. They pointed to research showing that young people's brains are still developing, particularly in areas related to impulse control and long-term thinking. They suggested that life in prison without parole would still ensure public safety while acknowledging the complexity of how Roof became capable of such horror. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that Roof's planning, his manifesto, his clear articulation of his goals, and his lack of remorse demonstrated that he was not acting on impulse or under the influence of uncontrollable mental illness. He was acting on ideology, an ideology he had chosen to embrace and that he continued to defend even after his arrest. Assistant U.S. Attorney J. Richardson told the jury, "He is not a boy. He is not a victim. He is not insane. He is a cold-blooded killer who carried out this massacre with precision." One of the most powerful aspects of the trial was the testimony from survivors and victims' families. In a moment that captured national attention, during Roof's bond hearing just days after the massacre, family members of the victims addressed Roof directly. One by one, they spoke of their devastating loss. And then, incredibly, many of them offered forgiveness. Nadine Collier, whose mother, Ethel Lance, was killed, told Roof, "I forgive you. You took something very precious from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never, ever hold her again. But I forgive you, and have mercy on your soul." This response, which came to be known as the Charleston Grace, stunned observers around the world. It wasn't universal. Some family members expressed anger and a desire for justice rather than forgiveness. But the public expressions of grace from a community that had every right to rage became a defining feature of the case. Some saw it as a powerful example of faith and resilience. Others worried it might be weaponized to suggest that Black communities should respond to violence with passivity rather than demands for systemic change. On January 10, 2017, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a unanimous verdict: death. Dylan Roof would become the first person sentenced to death for federal hate crimes. The verdict was not surprising given the overwhelming aggravating factors, but it was significant. It sent a clear message that domestic terrorism, particularly racially motivated terrorism, would be met with the harshest possible punishment under federal law. Judge Richard Gergel, who presided over the trial, formally sentenced Roof on January 11, 2017. In his remarks, Judge Gergel noted that Roof had shown no remorse, had never apologized to the victims' families, and had expressed pride in his actions. He called the crimes calculated and cold-blooded, and said Roof's ideology represented some of the worst elements of American history. Roof was sentenced to death on each of the 18 counts that carried that penalty, along with 9 consecutive life sentences and additional years for other charges. After sentencing, Roof was transferred to the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, where federal death row is housed. He joined a small group of inmates awaiting execution under federal death penalty sentences. As of January 2026, Roof remains on death row, and his execution has not been carried out. His case is in the appeals process, a phase that typically lasts many years or even decades in death penalty cases. Before we continue, if you've found this deep dive into the investigation and trial process valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe. We cover cases that reveal important truths about justice, psychology, and society. Beyond the legal proceedings, the Dylann Roof case sparked urgent conversations about domestic terrorism, online radicalization, and gun control. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, there were calls to remove Confederate symbols from public spaces. The Confederate battle flag was removed from the South Carolina State House grounds, a significant shift in a state where the flag had flown for over 50 years. Major retailers stopped selling Confederate merchandise. There was a growing recognition that symbols of the Confederacy weren't just historical artifacts, but active tools of intimidation and hate. The case also highlighted the inadequacy of how American law enforcement classifies and responds to domestic terrorism. While Roof was prosecuted under hate crime statutes, there is no federal domestic terrorism charge equivalent to the international terrorism statutes used for attacks connected to groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. This legal gap means that white supremacist violence is often prosecuted as hate crimes or murders rather than terrorism, even when the ideological motivation and intent to intimidate a population are identical to what we'd call terrorism if committed by someone with a different ideology. The online radicalization aspect of Roof's case was particularly alarming. He wasn't recruited by an organized hate group. He wasn't attending white supremacist meetings or rallies. He radicalized himself in the privacy of his bedroom, consuming content on mainstream internet platforms, following links from one extremist site to another, surrounding himself with a steady diet of propaganda that normalized and justified violence against black people. This model of self-radicalization has become increasingly common in the internet age, and it presents enormous challenges for prevention. How do you intervene when someone is radicalizing alone, online, without joining formal organizations or making explicit threats until it's too late? The psychological dimensions of Roof's case continue to be debated by experts. Some argue that his autism spectrum characteristics, his social isolation, and his depression made him particularly vulnerable to extremist ideologies that offered him a sense of identity and purpose. They point to research showing that many young men who commit mass violence share similar profiles. Isolated, struggling with mental health issues, feeling inadequate or emasculated, searching for meaning and belonging. The extremist ideology provides a framework that explains their personal failures as the result of external forces, offers them a heroic narrative, and promises significance through violence. Others caution against overemphasizing mental illness in cases like Roof's. They argue that this risks pathologizing hate, suggesting that racism and white supremacy are symptoms of individual psychological disturbance rather than expressions of deeply rooted societal problems. Most people with autism, depression, or social anxiety never commit violence. Most white supremacists don't have diagnosable mental illnesses. The danger in focusing too heavily on Roof's psychological profile is that it can obscure the ideological choices he made and the cultural context that made those ideologies accessible to him. What we can say with certainty is that Roof represents a particular type of threat that has grown more prevalent in recent years. The lone actor terrorist, someone who operates independently, but who is inspired by and acts in service of a broader ideological movement. He may have pulled the trigger alone, but he was not acting in a vacuum. He was part of a larger ecosystem of white supremacist thought that exists online and offline, an ecosystem that creates martyrs out of murderers and inspires copycat attacks. In the years since Roof's attack, there have been numerous similar incidents. White supremacist violence targeting synagogues, mosques, immigrant communities, and black churches. Each attacker has their own psychological profile, their own pathway to violence. But the pattern is clear. This is not a series of isolated incidents by disturbed individuals. This is a form of terrorism rooted in an ideology of white supremacy that continues to attract adherents and inspire violence. The victims of the Charleston massacre deserve to be remembered, not just as casualties of terrorism, but as individuals whose lives had meaning and value. Reverend Clementa Pinckney was a state senator known for his advocacy on behalf of marginalized communities. Cynthia Hurd was a librarian who dedicated her career to promoting literacy. Susie Jackson was a longtime church member and a pillar of her community. Ethel Lance worked at Emmanuel AME for decades. DePayne Middleton Doctor was a minister and admissions coordinator at a university. Tywanza Sanders was a recent college graduate trying to protect his aunt during the shooting. Daniel Simmons, Sr., was a retired pastor. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was a high school track coach and minister. Myra Thompson was a minister who had recently joined the church staff. These were people who opened their doors to a stranger, who invited him into their Bible study, who showed him kindness even as he plotted their deaths. The cruelty of Roof's crime lies not just in the violence itself, but in the exploitation of their generosity, their faith, their willingness to see the humanity in him even when he refused to see the humanity in them. The Emmanuel AME Church has continued its ministry in the years since the massacre. The church reopened for services just days after the shooting, a powerful statement of resilience and refusal to be intimidated. A memorial now stands outside the church, honoring the 9 victims. Inside, the Bible study continues, every Wednesday evening, a living testament that hate does not have the final word. As Dylann Roof sits on death row, awaiting the execution of his sentence, the questions his case raises remain urgent. How do we identify and intervene with individuals who are radicalizing online before they commit violence? How do we balance concerns about mental health with accountability for ideologically motivated terrorism? How do we address the underlying racism that makes white supremacist ideology appealing to some and creates the conditions where black communities must constantly fear racially motivated violence? How do we honor the memories of victims without giving their killers the notoriety they seek? There are no easy answers to these questions. What we do know is that Dylann Roof made a series of choices. He chose to consume extremist propaganda. He chose to believe it. He chose to plan an attack. He chose to walk into that church. He chose to pull the trigger again and again and again. Mental illness may have made him vulnerable to radicalization, but it did not force his hand. Ideology may have provided the justification, but thousands of people are exposed to similar ideologies without committing mass murder. At some point, individual agency and moral responsibility must be reckoned with. The federal death sentence reflects a judgment by the justice system that Roof's crimes were so heinous, so calculated, and so unrepentant that the ultimate punishment was warranted. Whether one agrees with the death penalty in principle or not, the sentence represents a societal condemnation of domestic terrorism in its clearest form. It says that targeting people for the color of their skin, that attacking people at worship, that attempting to terrorize an entire community will be met with the full force of the law. The legacy of the Charleston Church Massacre is complex. It is a story of unspeakable evil and extraordinary grace. It is a case study in how online radicalization can turn ordinary young men into domestic terrorists. It is a reminder of the ongoing threat of white supremacist violence in America, and it is a testament to the strength and faith of a community that refused to let hate define them. As we close this examination of the Dylann Roof case, take a moment to remember the Emanuel Nine. Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons Sr., Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson, and Reverend Clementa Pinckney. Say their names. Remember their lives. Honor their memories by continuing the work they did, building communities, promoting justice, and extending grace, even in the face of hatred. If this deep dive has given you insight into the complexities of hate crimes, radicalization, and the justice system's response, please like this video and share it. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how we can better prevent domestic terrorism, or how the justice system should handle cases where ideology and mental health intersect. And subscribe to this channel for more in-depth examinations of cases that reveal important truths about crime, justice, and society. The story of the Charleston Massacre is painful, but understanding it is essential if we hope to prevent future tragedies. Thank you for watching, and may the Emanuel Nine rest in peace.